Hey everyone, it's Christina Richardson, the celiac disease dietitian, and today I'm going to be talking about oats. More specifically, I'm going to talk about why it is that people with celiac disease in Australia and New Zealand are advised not to eat oats when pretty much the rest of the world considers them gluten-free. Well, stay tuned because I'm going to break it all down for you. So it was around the 1950s that oats started being excluded from the gluten-free diet, and originally this was based on anecdotal evidence, meaning that some doctors observe some of their celiac patients getting symptoms after eating oats, so they advised their new celiac patients to avoid oats as well. So the advice around oats in Australia for a long time differed from doctor to doctor. And it wasn't really until the 1990s and early 2000s that some decent studies started being carried out looking into the toxicity of oats in celiac disease. But unfortunately, the results of these studies seem to always contradict each other. Many studies have shown no apparent ill effects from eating oats, and others have observed mucosal damage in celiac patients who include oats in their diet. And that's why, even 30 years later, the topic of oats and their safety in the gluten-free diet remains controversial. So in Australia and New Zealand, FSANZ, who regulates our food labelling laws, decided to exclude oats and anything containing oats from the definition of gluten-free for two reasons. Number one, because the technology used to detect gluten in foods can't detect the protein in oats called avenin that is potentially toxic in celiac disease. The ELISA test that is used to detect gluten is primarily designed to detect the gluten proteins in wheat, the gliadins. It's pretty good at detecting the gluten proteins in barley and rye as well, but it just can't detect that avenin in oats, and I'll explain why a little bit later. So the second reason FSANZ decided oats could not be labelled gluten-free is that in Australia, oat crops are usually contaminated by wheat crops. So in the FSANZ assessment report that went on to inform the food labelling standard in Australia, it was estimated that oats would contain approximately 0.004 to 0.005% gluten contamination. Now that may not sound like much, but it actually translates to around 40 to 50 parts per million. That's over twice the acceptable threshold for gluten, which forms the Codex standard, which is used in Europe and America. But it also, of course, comes nowhere near the zero detectable gluten standard that exists in Australia for a product to be labelled gluten-free. So that's why even if a food product is tested for gluten and comes up zilch, it still can't be labelled gluten-free in Australia if it contains oats as an ingredient. Now, since that rule around oats was legislated, there has been some further research done in Australia that's tried to look further into the oats issue. The first study, which happened around 2006-2007 in collaboration with some researchers in Italy, was just conducted in test tubes. So what they did is they had some white blood cells in a test tube and they watched what happened when they added some cereal proteins. So they added some gliadin from wheat, some avenin from a few different varieties of oats, and also some rice proteins to act as a comparison. And what they found was that the rice didn't do anything. The avenin seemed to cause a small amount of activity, but only in two of the oat varieties. The third one did nothing. And the gliadin from wheat definitely caused a reaction. Now, obviously, this isn't the best evidence, given that it was only done in a test tube, but from this they concluded that some variety of oats may be potentially harmful to people with celiac disease, and therefore oats should remain excluded from the gluten-free diet. So that's where the advice sat for quite a while, until nearly 10 years later, in 2015, when another Aussie study was published. And this was undertaken at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research, which you may have heard of. It's quite well known for its celiac disease research. So in this one, they actually fed oats to people with celiac disease, and there were 73 people in the study, and they ate 100 grams of oats. That's just over a cup of oats for 3 days. And they measured their immune reaction to the oats by looking at the T cells in their blood. And what they found was that only 8% of the participants had an immune reaction in response to the oats. Now, there were some other interesting findings as well. What they found is that around half the participants developed symptoms from the oats. Most common symptoms reported were nausea, bloating, and lethargy. Some had diarrhea and constipation, and a few people had vomiting or reflux. Now, they did note that many of these symptoms could have just been from eating such a large amount of oats, because there's a lot of fibre in that amount of oats. But in my personal opinion, the nausea and vomiting is a bit of a concern. But this only happened in around a quarter of the subjects. The other thing to be aware of, which was quite interesting, is that the people who showed an immune response weren't necessarily the ones who got symptoms, and vice versa. Which means if you're able to eat oats without any symptoms, you may still be having an immune response, and you could potentially be getting silent damage to your villi. And this pretty much reflects other research to date about symptoms not predicting intestinal damage when it comes to gluten. So unfortunately in this study they didn't do any biopsies to see whether the immune reactions translated to damaged villi. Even though this study concluded that small amounts of oats probably wouldn't do any harm to people with celiac disease, the food labelling standard has remained unchanged. And the reason for that is, although it's likely only a small proportion of people with celiac disease react to pure, uncontaminated oats, it's impossible to know who these people are. And just because you don't react symptomatically to gluten, it doesn't mean you're free from any damage happening internally. So that means that after you've been on the gluten-free diet for a while and you've had the all clear in terms of your intestinal healing and recovery, you can, if you like, do an oat challenge for 3 months using certified wheat-free oats. And then after the end of the 3 months, you have another biopsy to make sure the oats haven't done any damage, and some blood tests to make sure that you haven't stopped absorbing iron or anything like that. And that's where we've sat in terms of recommendations for quite a while. But I'm not finished yet. So the brand new Australian study that has caused quite a stir of the porridge, sorry about that, was published in the journal Nature, which is a very prestigious international journal. So it goes a little bit further towards confirming that oats are probably not as dangerous as we thought, because they found that they contain hardly any of the specific proteins that are toxic to people with celiac disease when compared to wheat, rye and barley. You see, wheat is around 10 to 12% protein, and around 75 to 80% of those proteins are the gluten type, which affect people with celiac disease. So that means for every 100 grams of wheat, there'll be about 8.5 grams of gluten. Oats are also around 12% protein, but only 10 to 15% of those proteins are the type that could potentially be toxic to people with celiac disease. So that means for every 100 grams of oats, there's only potentially 1.5 grams of gluten. But people rarely eat 100 grams of oats. It's more likely going to be around 30 to 50 grams. But the most exciting part of what this study found is that these storage proteins in oats, which they thought were similar to the ones in wheat, are actually more similar to the proteins in rice, which we all know is gluten-free. So that might explain why around the rest of the world, most people with celiac disease seem to be able to eat small quantities of oats without any ill effects. Now, I know the question you're all asking is, does this mean Aussies and Kiwis can start stocking up on Uncle Toby's and eating delicious, delicious porridge and making some decent Anzac biscuits for a change? Well, probably not quite yet, but it's looking like this could be a real option in the near future. So if you want to see that happen, the researchers at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute for Research are currently looking for volunteers to take part in their oat feeding study, which we hope will once and for all clear up the controversy around the inclusion of oats in the gluten-free diet. And I'll put the link for that in the description if you're interested in helping make that happen. Until then, if you really want to eat oats, make an appointment with your gastroenterologist and tell them you want to do your own individual oat challenge. If you do end up doing this or have even done this before, I'd love to hear from you because I haven't really spoken to many people that have done this before, so I'm really interested. Let me know in the comments or send me a message on social media. So that's it for me today. If you liked today's video and you would like to keep seeing more videos from me, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel so that I feel the love. I'll talk to you soon.